Bojo, Ani, Dr
Okay.
Bimadoshka Pucan, Dijnakas, Saugeen Dunjaba, Jike Dodem. Welcome to my presentation today. I'm going to talk to you about land, people, and relationships on the Sauble River and about storing through digitization. Slide, please. There's a beautiful picture here you see of Chiefs Point. It's the particular area of Saugeen territory that we're going to be talking about today. I just want to add to Heather's land acknowledgement that what you're seeing here is the treaty belt, the wampum belt, the dish with one spoon. This is a peace agreement for the territory of that includes Montreal, but also Southern Ontario. It came at the end of a very lengthy war that was occurring between Indigenous groups here. Certainly, I bring the Anishinaabe perspective. I bring my community stories forward. And this belt was actually, it ended a 250-year war that really was a result of a lack of resources or too many groups coming in and taking too many resources off the land and causing groups to fight with each other. And so the peace that we know and love about Canada is encapsulated in this belt. And you can read more about the dish with one spoon if you go and have a look at the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701. That will give you some more archival documents so that can help you understand just how important this belt is, how important Montreal is, and in fact, how it came to be that we find Canada to be a very, very peaceful country to live in today. Slide, please. Okay, so who am I? Well, you heard my name is Bimadoshka. That means laughing water. I am a jingle dress dancer. I am of the Turtle Clan, which has a whole bunch of history in itself. If you know about Indigenous history, Turtle is not a part of the Anishinaabe clan system, not historically, but it is today. And that's a result of for me, it's a result of the War of 1812, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So I am a graduate of Western University. In the background behind me, you can see Voices of Chiefs Point. That's the exhibit where I disseminate my research results publicly and engage not only my community, but many Indigenous communities and, non-Indigenous folks to participate and learn from, but also contribute to this work. I'm a mom of 3 kids, and I really like this picture. This is Convocation Day, and it was just last year. It feels like a lifetime ago. But I like it because I'm reminded by the little guy who's wearing the Hudson's Bay shirt. He's 12 years old in this picture. I started back to school really late in life. He was 2 months old. So at 12 years of age, I now have a PhD. And every time I look at him, I'm reminded by the hard work and dedication and commitment that it took. And I'm grateful for my kids because I did it for them. Slide, please. I'd like to tell you about my territory. I love where I come from. I'm very proud to be from Saugeen. And before coming to into post-secondary, my identity was very much Saugeen First Nation, the reserve that I come from. That's what I equated, I guess, my land base to. That's who I was. I'm Saugeen. And then through my research and learning about the people involved with making the recording, you see Robert behind me, and then learning more about the history of the land and the people, it gave me a better understanding of who I am as an Anishinaabe person. And I now recognize that I come from a really, really big nation that straddles the US and Canada. And my work helps me to start to rebuild those relationships within myself, but also to bring those relationships back to my community to help us grow and heal from some of this stuff that's happened over time. So the map on our left, it's a 2D map, shows the Great Lakes region, and it shows the lakes within their Anishinaabe names. The lake at the center, that's Lake Huron, and that's where Saugeen is located on the eastern shores of Lake Huron. And that lake is called Nottoway Gitchigimig. Now, the language holds a lot of knowledge in it. And so Nottoway refers, it's a word that the Anishinaabe used to refer to the Haudenosaunee people, and in particular, the Mohawk people. But it also has to do with that really big war that happened in our territory. And so we remember that war by the names that we refer to in our land. And so the map on the right is a Google Earth map. And so what you can imagine is that we're hovering above Lake Huron now, and we're facing east. And if you look directly straight to the top of the page, you'll see, you know, like Montreal, and it lies dead in line with Chiefs Point, which is the reserve that we're going to talk about today. And so Ottawa is right along the way. And so this is where, you know, our people would travel around the lake actually, and head through up to the French River, down the Ottawa River, and then over and into Montreal to trade furs. Slide, please. You can read about my work in my dissertation. It's available online at Scholarship Western. You can see the link here, or you can actually see the information here, sorry. I welcome you to download it, have a read. There's a lot of pictures there, maps, and there's a lot more information there, particularly around genealogy, people who are looking to find information about their own families. There's hints there as to how I developed my work and found what I did. Slide, please. So I got started. There's me as a little girl. I was privileged, honestly, to spend a lot of time with my grandparents. That's my grandmother in the middle. Her name is Helen Solomon Mandawab. The name Mandawab will come up way later in our presentation, so I'll get you to hang on to that name in the back of your head there. So yeah, and then my grandfather was named Chief James Mason, came from a long line of hereditary chiefs, and together they shared so much oral history with me. And it was, as a child and growing up in the public school system, this is really difficult to manage for Indigenous people, because the stories that my grandparents had told me about our history, those aren't reflected in the history books. And in fact, it's talked about quite differently. And it really caused a lot of you know, cognitive dissonance for me as a teenager growing up. And so I didn't do well in school, hence me coming to post-secondary very late in life. But those stories my grandmother, my grandfather told me, in particular, my grandmother's stories, she told me a story once that it's changed my life. And so my grandmother told me, as a little girl, she said, there were two men from Saugeen fighting in a war. They were being pursued by the Chmokman. Chmokman is the Anishinaabe word for the Americans. So these two men were being pursued by the Americans. They hid in a hole in the ground, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. And that was the end of the story that she told me. Years later, I'm at Western, and I've always had a passion, like a hobby kind of, for the War of 1812. And at Western, I approached my professors and I said, you know, I want to learn more about the Anishinaabe involvement. And I'd like to do this reading course and see if I can't find out who exactly was involved of the Anishinaabe people, who was in the War of 1812. And I was advised by my professor that, you know, I wouldn't find anything, that this had been researched to death. And if there was anything to be found, it would have already been found. And so I was wasting my time. But I wanted to look for myself. I want to learn something, and I want to look and see for my very own self. And so I pushed the reading course. I was provided another professor to help me along. I'm grateful to him. His name is Dr. Rick Fair. He showed me this book here called The March of Medicine in Western Ontario by Dr. Edwin Seaborn. It's published in 1948. In it, Dr. Seaborn tries to account for the development of Western medicine in Canada. And so he starts out with his first chapters about Indian medicine. That's the terminology back then. And so where he writes about Indigenous medicines and the plants and how they supported settlers when they first came. And then he also has a chapter about French medicine and how the French people pursued their own style and cultural medicine. And then he ends up several chapters about, I would say, English medicine. And so Dr. Seaborn's book really helped me to start thinking differently about medicine, in that, you know, it's a cultural artifact, I guess is the easiest thing to put it as, and that every culture has their own way of approaching medicine, health, and wellness. And I'm really grateful to read this book. But in particular, reading this book, I ended up in this one part where he's talking that Dr. Seaborn writes that he recorded a story from an old Indian on the Sauble River. Now, I know my territory. I grew up fishing in all the rivers and in the territory. So I knew Sauble River right away. I said, hey, that's my territory. And as I read through the story, it goes on to write that this gentleman's grandfather had been fighting in the War of 1812, and the Americans were pursuing his grandfather and his grandfather's friend. And the grandfather shape-shifted both in himself and his friend into turtles, and they hid under a log, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. Immediately, my hair stood up. It was like I could hear my grandmother talking in my ears. And so Dr. Seaborn goes on to write that he made wax cylinders with this gentleman at the University of Western Ontario in the 1930s. And so I set out to learn something more about these wax cylinders. But even before I pursued them, I had to spend a lot of time just thinking about what this could mean. One of the things that I know from growing up, I'm a dancer. I've grown up in my culture of dancing and ceremonies. We don't record our sacred ceremonial knowledge. That's not something we do. So I was concerned about that, not knowing, is it actually sacred information, or is this gentleman maybe just making things up? And so we had a lot of questions, and I talked with my family, I talked with some elders in the community. I said, is this something I should pursue? And we all felt that whether it was sacred information or not, we had to listen to it to find out what it was. Slide, please. And so to plan out my project, I thought a lot about history and how we sort of ended up to be where we are today with these recordings in a museum. And so I thought a lot about, how do I make this research a part of the community so that the knowledge becomes mobilized and integrated within my community again. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that, how I did that. I'm going to tell you a lot about technology, people, and land. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the findings and implications, and then we're going to have some time for questions. And I am going to play you a sample of one of the recordings. Slide, please. I think we're going to open up, yes, with a video right now. It's a quick 6.5 video, a documentary I made with folks at TVO. Please.
Anishinaabeg culture is traditionally passed down from generation to generation through songs and stories. But when the Canadian government introduced the Indian Act in 1876 and created residential schools, Indigenous people were barred from practicing their religion and culture, leaving a gap in these oral stories. Thanks to one Saugeen First Nations woman and the help of Museum London, one community is rediscovering its history. Southwestern Ontario Hub's journalist Mary Baxter and I take a closer look at how audio recordings from 80 years ago, which many never knew even existed, are giving voices back to those who were silenced for decades.
I could hear Robert Thompson's voice, and I just screamed, "I can hear you!" Tears were streaming down my face. It had been so long waiting for this opportunity.
80 years ago, Saugeen First Nations resident Robert Thompson recorded songs, prayers, and stories that would remain untouched for decades. The scratchy, muffled, and sometimes inaudible recordings are what Bimadoshka Pucan had been searching for. 7 years ago, Pucan came across wax cylinders and aluminum disc recordings from 1938. That year, Robert and his wife Eliza Thompson shared Anishinaabe songs and stories with Dr. Edwin Seaborn.
They participated in making these recordings with Dr. Seaborn. Robert Thompson speaks Anishinaabeg. He sings songs, he tells some stories, and his wife Eliza then becomes the translator and translates concepts into English for us.
The cylinders and discs were passed through family and eventually donated to Museum London in 1975, where they sat in storage.
These recordings in particular, they sat on a shelf for 80 years. Nobody even knew they were there. Nobody knew the significance of them. And so I didn't want to see a digital file either end up on a digital shelf for the next 80 years. I wanted to see this knowledge become a part of the community again.
The cylinders are made from compact wax and have very fine grooves. They can be read by a dictaphone, but with the cylinders being so old and fragile, there were some hurdles. Of the 8 wax cylinders, 2 had to be repaired before the recordings could be digitized.
We had tried to keep our hopes somewhat realistic, not knowing what we would receive given the age of some of these of the cylinders, and you know, the recording techniques of the past were not quite what we have now.
In partnership with the museum and thanks to grant money, the cylinders were carefully packed and shipped to the U.S., where they were digitized. Anishinaabe culture is passed down to future generations through songs and stories, but the traumas of the 1876 Indian Act and the creation of residential schools barred Indigenous people from practicing their religion or culture and created a gap in these oral stories, making these recordings all the more valuable.
These important things that we're trying to teach young people about citizenship, pride, about identity, a lot of that stuff's missing from the history books, from public education.
Pucan, who also hails from Saugeen First Nation and is an anthropology PhD candidate at Western University, took the audio recordings back to her community.
I was scared. I really was. I was afraid that that maybe people would think I shouldn't be listening to them. I thought maybe people would be angry that finding out that these things had been sitting in a museum for so long.
To hear him from those recordings just kind of really gets to me, because it's like he's reaching from the past or from beyond and to the present. It's pretty awesome feeling.
Eugene, Bernice, and Harold are all direct relatives of Robert Thompson. He was their great uncle. They say hearing his voice brings mixed emotions.
I can't speak the language, but I can understand it. And that tears me apart.
But members of the Saugeen First Nations community says these recordings are a step towards reconciliation and a step to rediscovering their culture.
We did ceremony. We still do ceremony. The language is there. We still have the language, but we need to reinforce it more. And to bind the gap between the younger generation, the older generation, within all the families. It's really, really important to know who we are. And to have this type of connection, it's just so beautiful.
Pucan's search for what was on the wax cylinders came at a time when she was questioning her identity, but now she's proud of her community. In collaboration with Museum London, part of Saugeen First Nations history is now front and center with the Voices of Chiefs Point exhibit, where the public can also listen to the once forgotten recordings.
Hearing these recordings and hearing Robert Thompson talk about himself, his family, what they'd been through over hundreds and hundreds of years, it showed me that Anishinaabe people are resilient. They are strong. They're adaptable. They're industrious, and they know how to think for themselves. Okay. Yeah, so what I was kind of switching gears again. I got involved with the video too much, watching the pretty pictures go by. But so I wanted to do is not really knowing what was on the recordings. And I wanted to be extremely respectful, because being raised in ceremony, and being raised, dancing, I know the power of Anishinaabe Mishkeke, which is in Anishinaabe medicine. It's very, very powerful. And so I'm always very respectful and careful when I work with medicine or at ceremony, anything that can be considered sacred. And so it was important for me to respect that. I wanted to take a positive approach. I didn't want there to be any negativity surrounding these recordings, if in fact they were medicine songs, as it says on the label at the museum. And so what we planned to do then was to digitize these wax cylinders, to transcribe them, and then to translate them. And so that was my job, that part. And so I wanted to, in order to make sure that I took a positive and a holistic approach to my work, is I adopted the two-eyed seeing approach, which you can learn more about that from Elder Albert Marshall. He's from the East Coast. He tells us that when we're approaching knowledge and different groups of people that are working together, we really have to try to embrace these other ways of knowing and seeing the world. That, you know, everybody is coming with these different ideas, perspectives, experiences, and that when we're approaching our research methodologies, when we're even thinking about our findings, we really have to be able to see from other perspectives. That helps us keep things balanced moving forward. I want to take a community-based approach because of this knowledge and information. I want to see it come back home to Saugeen, and I want to see my community participate. So one in particular is that the recordings are in Anishinaabeg. So if you don't speak the language, you can't understand what he's saying. So it was really important that I had to build the community and for them to help me understand what I was working with. I was really influenced by Eric Laster's work at the Power of Kiowa Song. And I saw how he made community very central to his work. And as well, Keith Basso, Wisdom Sits in Place, who, again, the importance of the land and community in understanding history and events and how those continue to have outcomes today. Slide, please. So my master's degree in public health actually gave me a lot of tools in terms of positioning research to benefit the public and to benefit populations. So I started out with an environmental scan, and I chose this pestle analysis in which we account for the political, economical, social, cultural, technical, legal, and environmental aspects that can affect our projects. And in particular with the wax cylinders, they're housed at Museum London. And Museum London felt that they owned the physical property. They cared for it all these years. They continue to care for it, preserve, conserve it. And so they had a sense of ownership, and they felt they had something to lose, right? So from the Indigenous, like from Saugeen's perspective as well, is that Saugeen felt a sense of ownership too, because of the intellectual property contained on the recordings, that Saugeen felt like they owned that. So by bringing partners together and mediating conversations, teaching each side, we were able to start to think about how to move forward. Slide, please. So I wanted to make sure as well that I accounted for the OCAP principles, which I worked on in my undergraduate degree. I worked with a consulting agency who was supporting political and territorial organizations in the development of OCAP. And that has to do with ownership, access, control, and possession of cultural knowledge and artifacts. And so I wanted to embrace OCAP principles as well in my work. Slide, please. So what we developed was this collaborative approach where we brought partners together who all had a part to play in digitizing and returning the knowledge back to Saugeen. And so what we found was that the museum held a lot of power in the sense that they held the physical property. And so it was really about aligning with the community to give them more power in terms of negotiating how the project would play out. And so Western and myself, I of course aligned with my community in terms of trying to convince the museum that this was the right thing to do. The next problem was financial support. Communities, First Nation communities, are not well supported. We all know that. And so there's not a lot of, or very minimal funds available for cultural growth and expansion in First Nation communities. And so I really had to rely on Museum London for their support in getting this done. And so together we applied for a grant and we were successful. And the other part that we had to work on was our goal alignment. So what was it that each of the partners wanted to get out of it? For the museums aren't doing anything wrong. I want to make sure that I get that out there. Their museums do what they're designed to do. And so they're interested in conserving and preserving these physical objects. And so, excuse me, that was a really important thing to make sure that we accounted for as we move forward. And then as well for Saugeen was what was the community's goals? What did they need to feel that their needs are being met? So we had to negotiate, and that's where Saugeen and the museum agreed that the museum certainly at this point, the museum would own the physical property, and then the Saugeen would own the cultural intellectual property. And that way it bound Saugeen and the museum as partners, and that one couldn't move forward without the other. So that was really important part to do for us. And then we also had to make concessions, which is a part of that about, giving up some control, both sides giving up control a little bit in order to make it move forward. Slide, please. So about the technology, there you go. There's a picture of a wax cylinder. You can see how tiny those grooves are. Wax cylinders were invented by Alexander Graham Bell shortly after Edison invented the tin cylinder. And wax cylinders were intended to be easier to use. You could move them around. And so we don't need electricity to make the audio recordings on these wax cylinders. So these are from a time before electricity was in use. Slide, please. And so, I just want to get rid of this screen here. So the technological part of this was really problematic. The records that are associated with the wax cylinders are no longer in existence. Although they're listed in the FONS as being there, anything written that has to do with how Seaborn analyzed the recordings, if he transcribed them or did anything kind of work with them, all those records are gone. And so I was really starting with just the wax cylinder and having to work my way through those. In terms of understanding the collection itself, there's wax cylinders and there's lacquer covered discs. And a lot of them look like they're repeats of one another. And so what I did was I went and had a look at Frances Densmore's work. And you can see a picture of her here with a phonograph and an elderly Indigenous man telling the story. Maybe he's singing. This lady worked with the Anishinaabeg at Turtle Mountain for over 25 years, lived with them, and she recorded thousands of wax cylinders. Those are at the American Philosophical Society and some are as well at the Smithsonian. And so although she was at times employed by the government to collect this information, she actually wrote her findings up, and she writes about the process of making these wax cylinders, whereby she would take the machine out into the person's home, out into the community. She would do her recordings there. She would take the recordings back to her institution, and then they'd be converted to these lacquer discs. So I had to learn about this process so I could understand what it was why I was seeing what I was seeing, basically. Slide, please. Frances Densmore actually was really, really helpful to me for a lot of things. So here we have two broken cylinders. According to this technology that you see in the other picture, this is Irene. This is the digitizing machine, the laser software or laser machine, and then the software that we use to digitize the wax cylinders, and it's touchless technology. The cylinder gets slid on, and then the laser reads the cylinder or the lacquer disc. So with this technology, you don't have to fix the wax cylinders. They can be bound together with rubber bands, and then the software will go in and fix those places where the recording is broken. However, for the museum, that's not okay with the museum. Part of what they do is preserve, conserve. And so for them, they had to have these cylinders fixed in order to meet their mandate. So that what became our first issue, was to get these two cylinders fixed so then we could digitize the entire collection. Slide, please. Oh, we used a dentist, believe it or not. A dentist fixed those wax cylinders. He's got the tools and for working with the fine grooves. It was pretty incredible. to have that done that way. And so after we digitize, we send the collection off. There were 8 cylinders and 7 discs. That totals 15. We got 19 recordings back. And we went, what the heck is going on here? 8 and 7 does not make 19. And so listening to the recordings is very helpful. So it turns out that, again, back to Densmore's work and looking at the wax cylinders can hold anywhere from a minute to 4 minutes of recordings. Then the lacquer discs will hold up to 9 minutes of recordings. So on some of the lacquer discs, they've got multiple recordings on it. And so that's why we end up with 19 recordings instead of 15. So we hear, Seaborn even does a verbal smudge. He says, I cleanse my eyes, I cleanse my heart, I cleanse my mind. I hear Seaborn angry at the sound technician that the sound technician didn't show up. And so he's saying, I'm trying to figure out if I'm working this machine right. And it clicks off. It's only about a minute, that one. But then we have some songs and we have some beautiful stories that are, as short as they are, 2 minutes to 4 minutes long. They have an incredible amount of knowledge in them that one recording actually could build a full research project for somebody. And I'd love to see students come on board and take this on. You'll hear a funny conversation between a lot of people, and it's hard to understand what they find so funny, but everybody's laughing. And then as well, we're introduced to the female translator. In Seaborn's book, he never talks about women. Women are not involved at all. But we listen to the recording, and sure enough, there's Robert Thompson's wife translating into English for us. Slide, please. So the people who are just so magnificent, and I am so grateful to, this is Robert Thompson and his wife, Elizabeth Thompson. So what I wanted to understand was, what was Robert's authority to record sacred knowledge? I myself would not record sacred knowledge because I don't feel I have that kind of, I don't have that power. I don't see myself as having that kind of status, social status, I guess. But this gentleman, there was something unique about him. And so I wanted to find out what that was that gave him that authority. And so I spent a long time putting together this gentleman's genealogy, learning about his life experiences, and he did so much cool stuff. He holds a record in Bruce County for hauling the largest barge. So they would cut timber and then haul it to Southampton where there were furniture factories. So he holds the record for hauling the biggest load. His wife, Elizabeth, she would clean cottages for the people in the area. And believe it or not, she could not swim, but she got in a canoe every day, crossed the Sauble River to go and clean cottages. Just amazing, amazing woman. And then too, in doing the genealogy, I found that actually Robert had a first wife and he had 2 children. And unfortunately, both his wife and 2 children passed away. His wife and son passed away from yellow fever. And less than 10 years later, his daughter passes away of the Spanish flu. It broke my heart as a mom. I was just devastated. And I thought, how could this man go on with his life with this much loss? And again, it's these recordings, it's his knowledge, it's his connection to culture that makes him so strong and resilient. And of course, he's got this beautiful woman to help balance his life, and he remarries her. And so there's a big age difference between them. And that was kind of concerning for me because today we just, we tend to judge the past from today's standards. We have to be really careful not to do that. Slide, please. I'll address some of these things that I'm having issues with as I'm learning. So what I do is I go into Library and Archives Canada and I pull out the narratives, and those narratives allow me to create this genealogy of the family all the way back to, got all the way back to 1811, right before the War of 1812. And I find the grandfather, Saugeen, you see him there on top. And then his wife is also referred to as Saugeen Kwe. Interestingly, when I look to these census records out of the county of Essex, I do find Saugeen living in that area, which is near Windsor. And they're there because there's a fort there, the army fort. And the people are waiting to get word about the War of 1812, right? Whether it's going to start or not. So people are positioned close to the army, to the fort. So Saugeen is living there. And it turns out that according to the census document that he's living there with his friend, and his friend's name is Mandawab, my grandmother's last name. So now we're getting somewhere. Now I see how I'm learning about, right? These stories are shared through families. And so by the stories we tell, we can find who our relatives are. Just incredible. And so what I was also able to do with Library and Archives Canada is also find these, his children, their Indian names. Some of the names, we do know what they mean, but a lot of the names we don't. And that just is, it will take time to work with the elders around this, because somebody's written this down in English. It's not the way it necessarily sounds when we try to read them back in Anishinaabeg today. So you see this really long genealogy here. And at this bottom line that you see at the bottom of this sort of grid, I start to approach people that I've known in my lifetime. And so we do have a law in Canada called the 99-Year Privacy Act. And so to respect that, I stop my genealogy there. Slide, please. So one of the things I learned from the genealogy is something about naming practices and how names, how those practices changed over time. So Saugeen, he converts to Methodism in about around, I guess, just before 1850, about the 1840s. He converts, and the person who sponsors his conversion is a man named Thompson. So Saugeen, he takes the name Thompson because that's the person who sponsored him. And he becomes Thompson Saugeen. Now, when he has children, his children get named. Let's say here we have the first one. Here's John. John gets named. He takes his dad's first name as his last name. So now he's John Thompson. So if we can understand how these names move and slide around and how they get changed with each generation, that's going to help people start to put their genealogies back together as well. Genealogy is a pretty exciting thing in Anishinaabe territory. We really like to find out who we're related to and how things have changed over time, for sure. Slide, please. The other thing I did was try to get creative with trying to understand the genealogy. So like I said, Robert Thompson and his second wife, they were really spaced in age. And so, like I said, that was concerning for me. But in terms of understanding how things worked in the past, there weren't very many people who lived in the Saugeen territory at that time. And in fact, women died really young. And so men would then just, they would remarry, and the wives would be younger because the older women would have already passed away. So trying to understand, right, that there's these bigger systems and bigger issues at play. The other thing that was with Robert Thompson's first wife is I was concerned that it looked to me like they were possibly related. And that kind of bothered me. And it was something I really didn't want to kind of address or think about. But again, I didn't want to fall into those same patterns that I've seen with anthropologists of the past, Diogenes for one of them, who missed huge learning opportunities in his work because he was so, his Christianity, his dedication to it was so great that he couldn't address some cultural issues that he was witnessing. So I didn't want to fall into that kind of thinking either. And so what I thought is, well, I need to understand something about the totem system. If in fact it looks to me like people are related from our biological sense that we kind of think about it, the world today, what's different about the totem system? And so what I did was I took a nuclear family, which many families are not like that, but just to make it simple for me to understand. And what I did was I beaded it on a loom. In the blue, we talk about through the history, we kind of see in the history books that the clan system was passed down through the father's line for the Anishinaabe people. And so the blue line going down, like the snaky line, that's the males passing their clan down to the children. So here at the top, you see a blue and a black dot. That would be the father and mother, different clans. So when they have children, the two children, which I have there, just two dots separated by a white dot, those two children take the father's clan. And so when they marry outside their clan, and then the children become the clan of the father. So you can see the daughter, when she gets married, her children they have a black circle. So they're of a different clan than the mother. But if you think about it from a biological sense, that black dot and the blue dot beside it, those are first cousins from our perspective. But under the clan system, they are absolutely not related at all. And so that was a huge learning thing for me in terms of understanding that, we have to be able to think differently about history and really be careful not to apply today's ideas, today's standards onto the past. Slide, please. So in terms of the people and the land, here you see a map of all the treaties in Ontario. And in particular, we're looking at Saugeen, which is almost pretty much right in the middle. You can see it's Treaty 45 and a half. That was signed in 1836. And then we have our second treaty, which is Treaty 72 of 1854. So part of what the work I did was trying to locate this gentleman's family through time. And like I said, I found the grandfather way down. You can see by near where the 401 sign is at the very bottom of the map there. He was living in that area. But I wanted to try to follow this Saugee's name through time. And what happened is that this family moved around a lot. So at first they're down here, at the bottom of Ontario for the War of 1812. At the end of War of 1812, this family moves up to the London, Ontario area. And in 1827, actually 1819 first, the government shows up and says, we are going to take this land. We are going to set this reserve aside for you. If your people agree, you can go and live on this reserve. If your people don't agree, you must move outside this line. So people that agreed moved to the reserve that was set aside there. The others left. Saugee's, he took his family and moved north. And again, 1827, here comes the government again. Here's a reserve. If you agree, go to this reserve. If not, north of the line. So again, we start to then see and understand how families who don't want to be on the reserve, who don't want to, change, who don't want to live, I guess, like the settlers do. It's people who want to remain free and providing for themselves up from the land. So what happens is that when this treaty is being signed in 1827, he's actually sent for by someone from Saugeen, Chief Metigwab. And Chief Metigwab invites Saugee's and his family to come up to Saugeen. And he says, that recognizes that their settlers continue to move in and that he would like to have some strong warriors at Saugeen with him, and invites Saugee's to choose land at Saugeen, which he does. He chooses Chief's Point. Now, what happens is around the 1820s as well, into the 1830s, is that people start to starve in Saugeen territory because all the fur-bearing animals have been hunted and trapped out. So what Saugee's does, and in fact, Hudson's Bay Company had a fort, a trading post there in Southampton, which closed in 1822 because there was no fur left to trade. So Saugee's, what he in turn does is he crosses over to the Michigan side, and he and his family live there where there are animals to hunt, and he can feed his children. Nobody's going to starve to death. And he stays there for a number of years, about 20 years. And eventually, when the land in Michigan is all surrendered, which is pretty much occurring at the same time, the family then comes back around. They travel through Manitoulin Island and come back to Chief's Point. And so what I tend to see happen is that wherever the family is in a particular time, they tend to get referred to as having that identity. So in my community, many people told me, oh, the Thompsons, the Thompson family, they don't come from Saugeen, they're Americans. But again, it's because the family's carrying the story of them being there to hunt through the 20s, 30s, and 40s before they actually come back to Saugeen. So again, it's, and then I, of course, instructing my community and helping them understand, like, things were different. There was no America, US, that this actually drew a line between families and between our communities, and actually separated our nation. And it continues to affect how we think about each other today. Which I also noticed too is that people move really, really fast. So people, they could go from Chiefs Point to Montreal in 3 weeks with all their furs. This family, you know, they went around the lake and they did it a lot. They had family, you know, Saugeen wife originally comes from the Michigan side. And then in doing that research, I found, like in the genealogy research, I find that Saugeen his son, John, he married a woman who we would call today of the Southampton Métis. So at Chiefs Point, we have both Anishinaabe and Métis people together in one community there. And it's something that even at Saugeen today, we don't talk about. And this is new. This is new knowledge for us to actually talk about it this way. Slide, please. So some of my findings, I don't even have a clock available. Sorry about that. Certainly resilience was a huge theme that came out of my work. Looking at Robert Thompson's life, you know, his family's life, how they had been, you know, moved around and you know, fighting for their own survival, their own agency and right to live the way they wanted to live as Anishinaabe people. I'm shown that through their cultural practices, through the language, their relationship with the land, that provided that source of healing for Robert. But it does so for all Anishinaabe people. I think too, the other thing is that we tend to think of Anishinaabe people as, you know, they live in this you know, the wigwam, and they hunt and they fish and they ride around in canoes, and that's what an Anishinaabe person is. But it takes away from the fact that Anishinaabe people are really, really adaptable, and that they didn't live in a bubble. They certainly participated with the people who lived around them. Putting my exhibit out there, had cottagers from the area come forward and say, hey, look, my family kept a cottage log, which is sort of a cottage diary, where people recorded their thoughts and their feelings, the weather, environmental events that would happen around their cottages. And one family came forward and shared with me that Elizabeth cleaned their cottage, and that Robert Thompson was a very good friend of the family, and then shared excerpts from that cottage log with me about Robert Thompson. And it really confirmed all of those things I thought I was seeing, that it was sort of verified by somebody else's account as well about who he was and what was important to him, his values. He taught anybody. If you wanted to learn about Anishinaabe culture, medicine, language, he welcomed you. It didn't matter who you were. And that became an important part for me, for my ethics and about carrying his work forward, was to do what Robert did. And holding that as most important, that sharing and teaching of Anishinaabe culture and language and history, that it's important that people don't forget. We keep telling these stories so that nothing ever gets forgotten. You know, we don't have to and put them on a shelf and then struggle to understand again. And that's the power of the oral tradition. You know, he tells a story about the beaver story is one of the recordings. And talking about when the Anishinaabe first went to trade furs, that these young men were instructed to trade for zhonya, which back then would have meant silver, but today means money. So they were to trade for silver. But when they go to trade, the traders have guns, and the men are incredibly enticed by the gun. And according to Robert Thompson, it is the gun that actually affects the downfall of the downfall of the fur trade. It's where many animals, the land becomes just incredibly raped for all of its resources. And so that was a really huge and important thing for me to understand too. And then as well, the Anishinaabeg's ability to adapt to a changing environment was clearly evident to me through Robert Thompson's life. Certainly he hunted and fished, and he had a lot of fights with the local people about, accessing resources outside of relying on the government, because that was really important to Robert. He did not want to sign onto the Indian Act. He said over many times that he did not need the government to tell him how to live. He didn't need anything from the government. He was a self-reliant man. He knew how to live and feed himself and care for himself. And so he refused the Indian Act. And I'm grateful that he refused, because what that does for us today is it meant that land claim lawyers, who I did have a problem with while doing my research, it meant that they couldn't come in and remove these artifacts from our access. Because it meant that these recordings technically or legally couldn't be said to be owned by one person. You know, they didn't belong to a family. They, sorry, not to a family. They didn't belong to the reserve, so to speak, in the sense of the Indian Act, and that it really belonged to the people who, from who the stories come from, and that includes the Southampton Métis, you know, the Anishinaabe people, you know, and the Anishinaabe people who are on the American side. This includes them too, and so it's really this how. You know, policies really have had a horrible effect. But there are people who have made incredible sacrifices to make sure that we still have access to this knowledge today. And I'm grateful to Robert Thompson for that. Can you change the slide, please? I'm glad.
Bimadoshka, sorry to interrupt, but it's noon. So.
Oh, I talked too much. Let's skip over one. I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions. Let's skip over some more. But I also want to play a copy of the recording. Oh, here's the youth. We brought a canoe song home. And so what the youth did is they learned how to build a birch bark canoe. And when they completed it, including etchings and everything else, tarring it, pitching it, they then played the canoe song to bless the canoe. And we still have that canoe in the community today. The young people take it out regularly. Okay, slide. So the recordings have gone on to change us quite a bit. And I wanted to share this with you, that I'm not the only one in Canada working with wax cylinders. The amazing Jeremy Dutcher, who's super fabulous. Visit his, check out YouTube. You can hear a lot of his songs, see his amazing music video. And so at the same time I was discovering the Anishinaabe cylinders, Jeremy Dutcher was discovering the Wolastoq songs on the East Coast. And so what he did is he sings opera music, because he's a trained musician. So he sings opera with the recordings. I'm an anthropologist. I did an exhibit in a museum. So it's sort of like we took on, we take on who we are and we produce based on that. Want to change that for me? I was going to share a recording with you, but I also want to give you a chance to ask some questions. I'll pull up my chat button here if anybody wants to ask anything.
I can't think very good, and I must as well quit, and that's very good. Must as well something talking nice. That's all right. What's the name in English? What's in English? Yes. Well, what do you read? How do I talk? Easier. Or in English, what is it? With my wooden spoon around my neck, I'm on my way to the girl. I don't know what's the other one. That's well, the corn is how the cooking or corn is lump. Well, I don't know the reg. See, I don't know what to call it. That's a globe, that's a black. Montreal means Montreal. That's what got it. Well, I guess that's pretty cool. I don't know how far, but it's a long way to the 100 hectares. All right. Well, I used to go down to Montreal and to read about history. Now, sure. And that's the song they sang, and they paddled the canoe. It's rather nice swing. Oh, my. You know, yeah?
Yeah. So, are there any questions out there? I do have one here about, yeah, and I agree, Cynthia, about Elizabeth Thompson being really, really crucial to this work, and particularly for Seaborn at the time. You know, I felt like I didn't get to do enough to justify Elizabeth's contributions to the creation of these wax cylinders. By all of the work I had done, really, I really didn't think I was going to get the recordings. I eventually was getting to the point in my dissertation where I was going to write why I couldn't digitize the recordings. And, you know, like when the funding came and we digitized, it kind of just went really, really quick. And so I didn't get to spend as much time as I would have liked to around translating and transcribing the wax cylinders. And so I learned about her really, really late in my research process. Moving forward, it is definitely something I want to address because in terms of meeting with cottager folks who live in the area, who have been there for quite a long time, the information that they share with me lets me know that there's a lot more to Elizabeth's story. It's just going to take some work to uncover, you know, some of those, some documents and some other research to talk about her life. And I have a question here from Stephen. Hi. Hello, Stephen. Welcome. Do you want to say something about anthropology here? I know you're asking about anthropology and the field of oral history. I've spending a lot of time thinking about something over the summer, and it has to do with something called salvage ethnography. So at the same time that, you know, the government is outlawing Indigenous culture, the right for people to practice it. There's also, philanthropist groups who are pushing as well for the protection of Indigenous people. It seemed to be like it was this common theme or feeling that Indigenous people were going extinct. They were going to disappear. And so we have these really hardcore policies that try to push Indigenous people to change and embrace a more Western, I guess, Euro way of living to ensure that they don't pass into history. But it isn't just the government policies. You have the philanthropists, and then as well, here comes anthropology, which was created around the same time period, American anthropology anyway. And so we start to get the researchers who are going out there and wanting to record the culture before it disappears. And it's kind of what I think Seaborn was a little bit kind of working on as well. Or with under that idea, because again, at Chief's Point, eventually what happens, there's the land gets surrendered. The people are all forced off the land and forced over to Saugeen Reserve. But Robert refuses because he refuses the Indian Act because he is non-status. The government can't push him off the land. And Saugeen, in fact, makes sure that he can stay there as well and live out his life. And the communities all come together, all the people, both settlers and Indigenous, and they help as Robert ages and becomes a senior citizen and then an elder. Everybody kind of pitches in to help kind of look after him. So in terms of this salvage ethnography and salvage anthropology, I kind of felt like I was doing the same thing by now going into museums. And again, right, I'm going to salvage this stuff that's, but I've got a different outcome. And it's definitely doing something good for my community, for my nation, for researchers, right? For all of us. So I think that, it's okay to change. It's okay to adjust how you feel and our opinions and our directions based on the world we live in. And so I'm still trying to come to terms with that. Am I doing the same thing? Am I repeating the same things that were done in the past at least in terms of anthropology? But I see that by making my work applicable today, involving the community, helping to build capacity through knowledge reuptake. Those things are really important to me, and so I see that the benefits of that. So thanks for your question. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think if we want to give a little bit of time for people to discuss and maybe to eat before the AGA, I think we could stop the Q&A now. Thank you so much, Bimadoshka, for this great presentation.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you. It's my first time presenting on Zoom online, so it's a learning experience, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
That was pretty impressive. Thank you so much. But this is not over, so we can keep having the conversation. So the idea here was to try to bring people into smaller groups and to maybe have a conversation around Bimadoshka's presentation, and then maybe have a bit of time to have lunch, or maybe doing this both at the same time, whatever.